So in the last video, we created the circuit breaker connector, but it doesn't do anything as of now because there's no logic in it, but we have created a structure. So let's just try to test it. What exactly is the behavior right now? And even check if it really works or not. So I've created a project, added a listener so that I can hit this endpoint and just test it. So there's a logger added over here and it just records received request, and for main route I have a logger as well as main route, and fallback route has a fallback route logger, and in the end there's a response sent log. So I've already deployed the application, and let's just try to hit and see what happens. So it's sending the request, and if we see, the first log has been printed, received request, but after that nothing's printed, like either main route or the fallback route, or even the response sent is not printed, and the request is still in progress. So we haven't received any response yet. And the reason behind this is like this will continue forever. There's no end to it unless and until the runtime stops. And this will obviously get timed out, the postman request. But the reason why this is happening is because of the fact that every scope has a callback. And if that callback is not invoked, it will be in that state forever. It won't return any response. It will just keep waiting for response. So in this case, there's no callback return. The processing might be in progress, but since the callback is not written, I mean, it's lazy. Unless and until the callback isn't called, nothing will get. This chain of processor will not get triggered in the first place until and unless there's a callback added in the function, added in the code. So that is what we are lacking over here, because this is just an empty piece of code and it does nothing, just takes the information and it does nothing. So we'll try to resolve this in the later videos, but now the agenda for this video is to create a Hazelcast instance. So let's start with that. So meanwhile I'll just stop this, and now what we need to do is we go back to the circuit breaker code. I'll go back to the POM, and I've added two dependencies. One is the Hazelcast dependency and the other one is the common langs dependency. I need this common lang dependency for adding string function. I'll use some string functions, so I'm using this particular dependency. And Hazelcast is quite obvious. We need that for distributed storage of the circuit breaker states. So now let's go back to the code, and in this internal package I'll create a new class, and I'll name this class as CBClusterService. Alright, so the class is created. Now what I want to do in this class is I'll create a few member variables. So first is the cluster service instance itself. So whenever the application starts, it should initialize a cluster service object. So add it as I'll make it as private, and I'll make it as static CB cluster service. Now I want this object to be singleton, so that's the reason I'm giving it as static. So only one instance. I don't want to be an object member, but instead it should be a class member. So service instance, and let's just initialize this as null for the moment. We'll initialize it later on. Now another variable that I need is the Hazelcast instance. So I'll keep that static as well. Hazelcast instance will be the type, and its name, let's name it as Hazelcast instance. Okay, Control Shift O to organize the imports. All right, now Now I need a replicated map. Like we discussed in the previous video, like there will be a replicated map. So this is the replicated map which will store the name of the application as key and value as the state of the circuit breaker. So let's just create this private replicated map. Now this will be instance of object. I'm not making it as static, and it will have string as the key, and value will be, now value will be the circuit breaker state. So what I'll do, I'll create an enum to have the state. So let's just keep it as CB state, and I'll just create this class CB state, and let's name this as CB state map equals null. So everything will be null. We'll initialize it later on. Now let's create a CB state enum. I'll select enum and name it as CB state. So I'll declare a couple of enums. One would be, it will basically have the states. So it should be like, what are the states that we decided? So what we decided previously was open, closed, and error. So let's just go ahead and add it. Closed, error, and open. Now other important thing is that this state will be persisted in the memory itself, but across different machines, right? So it has to move from one JVM to the other JVM, which will be done by Hazelcast. So we need not worry about it. The only thing that we should address is we should make it as serializable because it's being sent over the network to different JVM. So the other JVM should be able to reconstruct it. So we'll implement serializable and Control Shift O to organize the import, and it should be from Java IO serializable. All right, so this is done. Now let's move back, and again let's organize the import over here. So Control Shift O, and we have replicated map imported. Next up is we want to have the error counter. So again, let's go back and see we had a PN counter, and that PN counter will be error and for operations. So that is what we are adding over here. So I'll add private uh, map. We'll keep it in a map, and this will have, map will have uh, name of the circuit breaker and the PN counter. So key will be string and then PN counter. So one will be for error. So let's name it as error counter. And let's just initialize this new hash map. Right, Control Shift O to organize imports. So it's from Java util and Java util dot map. So even replicated map is implementation of Java util map. So we have all the methods that the interface map states. Now similarly, we create the same for operations count. So the error percentage that we'll find out will be ratio of error count to the total operation, right? The total request. So for that we are doing this, having this variables. So it's request counter, and we have the error counter. Now finally, let's add a logger because we need to log things to understand. So private static final logger equals get logger. Now get logger would require a static import. I'll do that in a moment. So let me just quickly import a static logger for it. So import um, org dot sl4j dot logger. Right, so that should get me rid of it. And for get logger, I need a static import. I'll just add CB cluster. Okay. All right. So what's missing is it's complaining about get logger. So let me just import this. So I'll do import again this. So I'll do a static import. So import static and it should be org.sl f4j dot logger factory. So it should be logger factory dot get logger. So you want this one and it should do the job. Yeah. So we got rid of the compile time errors for this logger. Now it's time to initialize the cluster service. So we'll initialize it through the constructor. So anytime if someone wants to create the object, he'll probably use the constructor. So I'll keep this constructor as private so that the we want basically to implement a singleton pattern. So I'll keep this as private and the access to the constructor to just create can be given through only a single method. So I'll make this as private so that it's not visible to anyone and no one can initialize externally. It should be via a method that we expose. So let's create a private constructor and this will take CB config params. So the config params is the one that we created previously. I'll just show that CB. Let me add it first. Config control space config parameters. All right. So if I just control click on it, so these are the parameters that we need: members IP, host IP, and the cluster port. So let's go back and write some logic to initialize the service instance. So let's first add a logger.info. We can later on change this to debug, but since we would debug this code initially, it's better to have it as an info initializing Hazelcast cluster. Okay, then what we'll do is we'll create a config. So for Hazelcast to work, it needs a config. Okay, so let me add a config and name it as Hazelcast config. Cast config equals new config. So we have config. Let's import this. So it should be from Hazelcast. All right. So we have this config. Now we'll set this config. So using Hazelcast config dot get network config, it returns me the network config object. And then what I'll do is I'll set public address. And this public address will be the host address. So this address will be visible to the other members of the cluster. So the host address, which can be retrieved from config parameters because we already are taking it from there. So config parameters dot get host IP. Now again we need to add a port for this. So we'll set port for this machine. It's the machine on which it will run. So set port. Again that can be retrieved from config parameters. So config parameters dot get um, cluster port. So cluster port will be the port of the machine also on which the Hazelcast has to start. So we set the port Okay, it's giving error because this is string, right? Yeah, it wants int. So what I can do is I'll parse integer. So I'll use integer, a wrapper around the primitive int. Integer parse int method to parse this integer. Okay, so that's done. So we have this Hazelcast config populated. Now we need to create a join config so that they can join each other. So let's just create join config. Okay, join config, join equals. Now this join config will be retrieved from the Hazelcast config. So Hazelcast config dot get network config dot get join. So now we have the join in this join config. And now the next part is we need to add all the member IPs that we have set in this config parameters to this join config. So how do we do that? First of all, we ensure that whatever has been passed by the user is not blank because we have added in the summary, right, that it should be comma separated value. So what we'll do, we'll split by comma, get all the IPs. But in case if it is blank, there's no point of splitting. So now we'll be using the string utils from Apache's common lang 3. So that is why I imported that. So string utils. Okay, string utils. So the Apache common lang 3 string utils dot is blank. So is blank will help us. So I'll use is blank, and is blank I'll send the member IPs. So config parameters dot get member IP. So in case if it's not blank, only then I'll take further action. So list string. Now we'll convert that into list. We'll split by comma. We'll get an array. We'll convert it into list. So let's just convert it to list. Member IP list equals, now that's a string, right? So arrays dot stream. Now it arrays stream of arrays can take all the string values. So I'll just get it config parameters dot get member IPs. Okay, and now I need to split the string, split and split using comma because those are comma separated values. And now this is converted into an array stream. Now since it is an array stream, I can add a logic for it by using map function. Now in map I need to add a mapper, so let's just add a mapper. So for each IP, because the array will have IP addresses in string format, so for each IP what I'll do is I'll create a IP colon port construct. So that will be the whole address, right? It will be something like this: localhost, which means that the IP address colon the port number. So that is what I'm trying to do here. So IP plus just concatenation colon plus config parameters dot get cluster port. So we have concatenated. Now it's still not a list of array. So I need to use the collect function to convert it into list. So I'll pass an instance of collectors dot to list. So this will give me an array list. Right, so we are pretty much done. What's pending is to import this list. Just what's wrong over here? Okay, the list type is not generic. Mhm. So I think let's just Control Shift O to import. It's not importing. I'm not sure, there's something wrong. Let me just manually add the import java dot util dot list. Okay, and the compile time error goes away. So now we created a list of member IPs. Now we want to add this to the join config. So we'll do that in this condition itself. So let's join dot, we'll use TCP IP config. So there are multiple config, AWS, Azure, but we'll go with TCP IP config because we want to run it on our local machines. So let's go with TCP IP config and let's just set enabled equals true so that it's enabled. And then what we'll do is we'll set the members. So set members. Now this members wants a list of string which we have already created. So let's just pass the member IP list. So we have completed adding the members IP to this join config. So that's the one part that's being done. Now next we need to initialize the Hazelcast instance. Okay, there's some wrong import. Let me just remove this. Okay, so now it's good. Now it's time to finally initialize the Hazelcast instance. So this is what we want to initialize. Let's copy this and paste it over here. And now we need to use Hazelcast class, and it has a static method called new Hazelcast instance. And this new Hazelcast instance can take a config object because we created this config object, right? This config object has the public IP of the host and the member IPs. So it's important that we send this so that the Hazelcast instance gets created with all of these values. And once we have the Hazelcast instance initialized, we can create a CB state map. So we want a map to be created, right? A replicated map object. So let's initialize CB state map. CB state map is a replicated map. So CB state map is equals to Hazelcast instance. Now we'll be doing everything on this Hazelcast instance because we have it now. So now get replicated map, and this replicated map will give it a name so that the map has a name and it can have all this value. So to give this a name, what I'll do is I'll create a constant class so that everything gets added to the constants. So to do that, let me just create a utility package. So we are trying to organize things properly so that uh, things are as per some good coding standards. So let me just create resiliency dot connectors dot, what should I name this? I'll name it as utility and add a static class called as CB constants. So this will be a single point wherein we can change any constant that we want rather than hard coding a string right away. So I'll add CB constants. So this is a constants class. Okay, now let me add the constant that I wanted. So it's public static. It should be static because I do not want to create an instance. I just want a single value and I should be able to call using the class name. So constant string, let me give it as replicated map. Replicated map name equals, and I'll just name it as circuit breaker. Okay. So we have one constant and now let's use that constant over here. So it's just a good coding practice because now I can use this constant anywhere in the code, and if there is a change, there's only a single point where I need to make the change. I do not need to go in every class and search for that and change it. So that's the benefit that we get by using this constant. So I'll make it as CB constants dot replicated map name. All right. So now we have got a replicated map with the name circuit breaker from the Hazelcast instance. And the Hazelcast part is complete now. So let's just print a logger.info, and in this we'll print Hazelcast instance initialized successfully. Okay, so we have initialized the Hazelcast instance now, and now let's add a few more methods. So first one is if someone wants to set the service instance. So we haven't set the service instance yet. So the access will be through the service instance only. So how do we do that? Now, since I want it to be singleton, I made the constructor as private. So we need to have some uh, method which is public and that can be exposed. So I'll create a method name as set service instance. So public static, this will be public, and we'll give access through this method. So public static synchronized. Uh, Now the reason why I'm making it as synchronized because I want it to be a singleton object. And if I do not make it singleton, if I do not make it as synchronized, now in case if there are multiple threads and things are occurring parallelly, we might encounter a situation where we get two instances created, and getting two instances created will result into unexpected behavior because we want to share this particular Hazelcast instance if there are multiple applications in a single runtime. So that is why I want this to be a singleton for at least for one application. I do not want one application to have multiple configurations for the Hazelcast instance, only one per application. So that is why let's make it as synchronized, and this will return CB cluster service instance, which is the instance of this class. I'll name this as set service instance. So anyone who wants to set the instance, initialize the circuit breaker, needs to call this method. And he also has to pass CB config parameters because it's only through this parameters we know what is the public IP of the machine, what is the member address, what is the port, right? So we need those parameters. So we'll pass this parameters CB config. Let's just name it as config param. All right. So now the next step, what we need to do is, so it's giving compile time error because we haven't returned anything yet, but we'll return. So if now if we want to check, right, if it's already initialized, we need not initialize. If it's not, only then we should initialize. So if service instance is equal to null, strictly equals to null, only then we initialize it. So what we do is we simply set the service instance equal to new CB. So we use this constructor because this is a method which will help us to initialize. So CB cluster service, and we'll pass the CB config param. Perfect. Now we need to return this service instance. Now what if the service is already initialized, the Hazelcast instance is already initialized? In that case, we do not want the user to create a new one. So we'll fail the deployment itself. So I'll just throw an exception, illegal argument Why is this not working? Okay, I think it wants me to type final type illegal state exception. Sorry, it's illegal state exception. All right. So this is not a desired state. So in this, I'll just send a message. Hazelcast instance is already initialized. Is already initialized. Only one circuit breaker config. So this will be through config, right? So I'm writing per application is allowed. So if someone tries to configure multiple ones, so in that case, it should throw the exception. Now it's still complaining, unhandled exception. So I probably need to throw this. Okay, so now it looks good. Okay, but I think this illegal state exception is unchecked exception. So the reason it's asking me to throw is it's checked exception, but that's not right. I think the import is wrong. I don't need this. It should be unchecked. It's not a checked one. So probably the import is wrong. Let me just check the import. So it's coming from Java X resource space. So this is not the one that is desired. We want it to be unchecked, and now it has taken from the correct one. All right, so now it's gone. So it happened because we had the wrong import in place, and that is why it was giving it. It considered it as a checked exception, and it was asking me to rethrow it. Now, since it is unchecked, I need not rethrow it through or even handle for that matter. So now we have a method using which we can initialize the circuit breaker instance. Now, if someone wants to get, since we are setting, we also want to get, right? Someone who wants to get the access to this instance. So again, I'll add a get method and I'll again make it as synchronized. Synchronized. It should be CBClusterService. It should return this one. Although we might not need it, but it's just good to have this. Get CB I'll write it as get service instance, and then we'll return the instance. So let's just check if service instance is not equals to null. So what I'll do is I'll just copy paste this thing, just paste it and modify the condition. If it's not null, then I return the service instance. I do not need to initialize this because it's already initialized if I'm doing a get on this method. And if it is null, I'll throw this exception, but the message will be different now. It should be Hazelcast instance not yet initialized. Initialized. Please configure circuit breaker, or else please add a circuit breaker config. All right. So we have a method to set, we have a method to get, and we'll need this method. So that's the reason I'm just creating it. And later on, when we progress further, we'll use this method. So, okay, now this is one thing. Then what else do we need to add? We need to add getters, and we don't need to add setters. We'll just add, okay, we'll just add setters and getters for this error counter and request counters as well. So create getter and setter for error counter. Okay, let's do the same for request counter. Okay, so we have getters and setters for the error counters as well. Now, if someone wants to just get the Hazelcast instance, so how does one get it? So we'll also add extra method. However, they can also get through this get service instance, but we'll again add a method so that one can directly get it. So public static Hazelcast instance get Hazelcast instance, and this will just return. Okay, so what's the error? Thing Hazelcast instance. Okay, so there was a typo, and all right, so we are pretty much ready with all the methods. Now, one is to initialize. Now you also want something to destroy as well, right? If the runtime shuts down, and in that case, we want to release everything and we want to destroy this object, or the application which is having circuit breaker shuts down. We want everything to be removed. So we add a method for destroy. Public static Hazelcast instance. Not Hazelcast. We'll keep it as void. Public static void destroy. I'll just name it as destroy instances. Okay, and then what we need to do is call Hazelcast instance dot shutdown. So this will close the Hazelcast, and service instance object is of no use now. Set it to null. Okay, so now there's no way anyone can access service instance because now it's pointing to null, and the object is released for garbage collection. Okay, so we are pretty much ready now with the instance. Now, one more thing we need to add is I'll come on that part later on as we progress in the video, but just so that we are ready with this service class, I need to add a scheduler because there will be a scheduler running. Now, imagine when the circuit goes to when the first error occurs. Okay, so when the first error occurs, there should be a scheduler started, right, which will keep track of the duration for which the error has to be monitored and what is the threshold. So that will be basically a scheduled task which needs to be added, right? And that will be probably a runnable from the executor service. So for that to happen, we need to have a scheduled task method. And the same will happen when the circuit opens. So from open, if it has to go back to the closed state, there should be a schedule to monitor the open duration or to keep track of it. So for that, we need to have a scheduled task method. So what I can do is I'll create public static void. So this will help me to schedule task. Schedule, name it as schedule tasks, and runnable. It takes a runnable. So let's have an argument runnable and then a delay, string delay for how long or after what delay it should pitch in. The task should run. So Hazelcast. So this, for example, the first error occur and the circuit state went to error, right? So at that time we'll give delay based on the threshold period. So if it is 5 minutes, this task will trigger after 5 minutes to check if the ratio has been reached or not. If it is reached, it will trip the circuit breaker. So that's the delay. Now Hazelcast instance dot. Now in this Hazelcast instance, we have a scheduler executor service. So Hazelcast has its own scheduler service. So we'll get that. Get scheduler executor service. Yeah, now we have it. Now for this service, we need to give the map name. So we'll use again. So now it's useful, right? The constants that we created. CB constants dot replicated map. So using this replicated map on this, because we want to change on this, right? So dot, now let's schedule this. Let's schedule. Now schedule needs a runnable. So we'll create a runnable. And then the second argument is the duration. So we'll add the delay. So delay will be the one that we get through this call. For example, not the logger, but let's go to this configuration. So it should be threshold period or the open duration. So that will be set. So this is a period and this is in ISO 8601 format. It's in the duration format. So we need to parse this string to duration. So the string will be sent and we'll parse this. So duration dot parse string delay. So this is the delay that we parse and we'll convert this to millisecond to millis and time unit will be milliseconds. So let's use time unit. So that again is an enum dot milliseconds, right? Okay. So yeah. So now we are ready with the whole CB service instance, and yeah. So we are pretty much done over here. Now the next thing that we have to do is, wait a second. Okay, we don't have the CB state map. So what I can do is I'll just create a getter for this. No need to add a setter. Okay, we also need a setter, but I'll name it as something different. Okay, so we have a getter for this. Now one part that is pending, that how to set the CB state. So where there is a, so here is the get CB state, right? So I'll not include a set CB state. Instead, I'll name it as absurd because we'll use this method to change the circuit breaker state, right? So if the key for that circuit breaker exists, then it's fine. If it doesn't, we'll add it. And if it exists and we want to update, so we'll update it. So it's basically an absurd operation, right? So I'll name it as public void. Setters are always void, right? So so to get some sense, I'm not writing the method name as set, but instead I'm making it absurd. So absurd CB state map entries. So we are absurding it. So to absurd, we need the key, which is circuit breaker ID, and the value is CB state, which is an enum. So CB state and should have a state. Okay. And then CB state map dot put, and put will put the circuit breaker ID value should be state. Let's add a couple of loggers so that when we run into issues, we should be able to understand what's happening. So absurding state for circuit breaker ID and state as, okay, and circuit breaker ID and state. Perfect. So now we have everything in place. Now we are not missing anything. We have setters and getters for all of the variables, and we also have initialized the service instance and the Hazelcast instance as well. Now This won't work. This won't work unless and until, hold on, I think the duration is imported from the wrong package. It should not be from log4j. It should be from time instance. So this is something wrong. Import java dot time dot duration. I'm changing the import because I'm not sure the other duration that got auto imported, how it behaves. I know this the behavior of this time duration, so I'll be using this one. Okay, so now uh, it's pretty much ready, but now it's not going to do anything unless and until I call it from somewhere, right? So from where do I call? So we created a configuration service, right? So this is where we'll call it from. Now this configuration service will be called by the runtime when the runtime starts. So whenever the runtime starts, it starts creating the bean based on the configurations that we have specified. And then once the beans are generated, uh, it starts the application, right? That's part of the Mule runtime lifecycle. So when the runtime starts, it has two methods, startable and stoppable. Startable when it starts, stoppable when it stops. So we need to implement that because since we cannot link this configuration service to the route, right? To this route, we cannot add it over here because this is a route and route doesn't allow us to have any global configs, right? Where we can set connections or anything. So since we are adding it separately and we want it to initialize at the beginning, not when the circuit breaker is called. So that's the reason we'll have to implement those two classes, two interface, sorry. Those interfaces are startable. Let me just implements startable and stoppable. So these are two interfaces and it's complaining about the methods we haven't implemented. So let's just implement. Before doing that, let me add a logger so that um, we can log things. Static final logger equals get logger, and this logger will have class dot class. Perfect. Imports are pending, so I'll just import logger from slf4j and a static import for this. I'm not sure why the IDE doesn't help me to add static import, but I'll have to add manually in that case. Logger factory dot get logger. So that's done. Now I need to implement these two methods. So import startable, import stoppable, and then implement unimplemented methods. Okay, so let me just remove this comment. So now in the start method, what I'll do is CBClusterService dot set service instance, and what's that? It needs config, so we'll pass this config. All right, so this is where we had to use the CB service instance. So we call the CB service instance uh, set service instance method, and we are passing the config. Now let's add a logger.info. What I'll do, I'll add it at the end. Initially, everything is done in the CB cluster service constructor. So set it at the end. Hazelcast instance initialized. And in the stop method, I need to destroy everything. So I have created a method, right? So CB cluster service dot destroy instances will destroy everything, and let's add log here as well. Hazelcast instances destroyed, instance destroyed. Perfect. Now everything is in place. So what we can do is now we can try to run this. So now I have incremented the POM version for this CB connector. So if I uh, go back to the connector code, I incremented because I wanted to test. So 1.0.1 snapshot instead of 1.0.0. So we are slowly incrementing the patch version as we are adding the features, new features to it, and then I have updated it in the Mule application as well. So it's 1.0.1, and what I've done is I just redeployed. It still won't be able to do anything, but it's just that it will be able to initialize the Hazelcast cluster. So I've just run the application and it has got deployed. Now let's see the logs. So it says it's starting app CB demo apps, and over here if we check out, it's starting resource manager, started resource manager, then it comes to the abstract lifecycle manager, and then it calls the startable method. Uh, so in startable, we have the method implementation and it's printing a log initializing Hazelcast cluster from the CB cluster service. So it's using this public address because it's default that we added in the connector, and it started the Hazelcast cluster on the port 5701. Now Hazelcast is bound to 127 in the loopback, and the loopback mode is disabled in configuration. And then it's using multicast DC, discovery. And if we finally see the logs, we see that it is able to start a cluster with member size as 1 because we didn't add any other IPs, and those IPs, even if we add, I do not have two machines right now to test this. So I already have a single machine, so it's able to start this cluster. And then Hazelcast instance initialized. This is coming from CB configuration service, and the other one is from CB cluster service. So which means that whatever we configured thus far is working correctly. So CB Hazelcast cluster has been initialized successfully. Now, what remains after this is we need to add the algorithm or the logic for the circuit breaker to open and close. And for that, we'll create a CB processor class and we'll add all the logic into that class. So for this video, let's end it over here and we'll see the next steps in the next video. So I hope until now you have understood uh, whatever the idea is, and that is why I'm progressing in parts so that you get a better understanding. So thanks for watching.